Today's discussion is going to be on World War I weapons, technology, and life. World War I, or the Great War as it was called back then, is considered the first modern war, and we're going to discuss some of these topics. After the first month of the war, lines stabilized and the long stalemate period between the Central and Allied powers began. No Man's Land was a result of this. It separated the series of trenches on either side and was an area that no one controlled. It was a pockmarked hellscape where horses and men were sent to die, with little resemblance of the forest and farmlands that had once dotted the area before the war. Because of the newly developed deadly weapons and certain death that awaited you in no man's land, trenches were seen as the best means of survival, and why World War I developed a reputation for trench warfare. From the diagram, you can see that it was actually a series of trenches developed by both the Central and Allied powers. The frontline trenches were also protected by barbed wire entanglements and machine gun posts. There were also support trenches, reserve trenches, and firing bays, as well as communication trenches that traversed the various lines. I would like to point out that since the Germans were on the offensive before the stalemate began, they had been able to choose the best pieces of land to build their trenches. The higher ground also gave them a tactical advantage and forced the French and British to build their trenches in less favorable conditions that were rarely more than a few feet above sea level, often filling with water, and typically not built as soundly as their German counterparts. Although trench life was not glamorous, living in the trenches was the best way to stay alive and staying out of no man's land where you were guaranteed to die. The realities of trench life were extremely difficult. Some of the highlights, or lowlights if you will, would be the backed up latrines, rats, rotting feet, lice, diseases like trench foot and influenza, and the constant fear of death, all while in various seasons of precipitation and both hot and cold weather, all while wearing a wool uniform. Because of the constant rain and backed up latrines, the trenches were often filled with stagnant mud, water, and feces, sometimes up to the knee. Thus, keeping feet dry was often an incredibly difficult task. Trench foot often developed in many of the soldiers, and it was an incredibly painful condition of the feet, caused by long immersion in water and marked by blackening of the feet and death of human tissue. As you can see from the pictures, trench foot was horrendous, and it was estimated to have killed about 75,000 British soldiers alone. As the condition worsened, the feet would begin to swell and turn into open sores, and the dead tissue would literally begin to rot away. If left untreated, it usually resulted in gangrene and amputation. The smells of trench life are also difficult to imagine. Rotting carcasses of human and animal remains left in no man's land, the stench of overflowing latrines, body odor of soldiers unable to bathe, along with various chemicals and gunpowder, cooking food and cigarette smoke, all rolled into one. Because of the inexhaustible food source of both the dead soldiers and empty food cans that were thrown into no man's land, rats literally thrived in the millions. They were extremely brazen and often crawled over men trying to sleep in the trenches and dugouts at night. It got so bad that rats fettering in no man's land actually kept men awake at night. Another picture that shows you how bad the rat problem truly was during World War I. To give you an idea of how fast they could reproduce, a single rat can produce about 900 offspring in a year, spreading both infections and contaminating food as well. Lice was a constant annoyance for soldiers on both sides. The German soldiers in this picture are checking for lice. The lice bred in the seams of the filthy clothing and caused men to itch unceasingly. However, even when men and clothing were washed and deloused, the lice eggs remained hidden in the seams of the soldiers' clothing, and when they would put their clothing back on, their body heat would generate the eggs to hatch and the cycle would begin again. Weapons of World War I. The rifle was the go-to standard issue for a frontline infantry soldier for both the Central and Allied powers during World War I. Here are a few such examples. The German Mauser, The British Lee Enfield, the French Lebel, and the U.S. Springfield were all typical rifles that would be found on a World War battlefield. Although machine guns predated the war, they were used more efficiently and in large numbers. A single machine gun was the equivalent to roughly 70 to 100 rifles. Although fully automatic, they often overheated rapidly in both air and water-cooled forms. Thus, they were usually grouped together to maintain a constant defensive and firing position. Typically, they were situated on flat tripods and required crews of 4 to 6 men. The Shosha, or commonly mispronounced Shosho by American soldiers, was a light machine gun used by both French and AEF soldiers. It was one of the first light machine guns ever designed to be carried by a single operator and assistant. However, just like many first-generation inventions, it experienced problems. The harsh conditions of trenches, along with the magazine's open side and weak springs, exposed the gun and ammunition to mud and grime, and notoriously had issues jamming, and was hated by American servicemen. The undersea boot, or undersea boat, was used by various countries during the war, but most notably the Germans. It wreaked havoc on sea lanes and merchant shipping, especially the British, sinking some 5,000 ships and destroying over 10 million tons of cargo. However, its unrestricted use was the main catalyst for the United States' entry into the war. The invention of the tank was in response to the stalemate that had developed on the Western Front. The British initially dubbed them land ships, but to keep secrecy, were referred to as tanks because of their resemblance to steel water tanks. It was first used at the Battle of Fleur-Courcelette in 1916, part of the Battle of the Somme, 2 years after the war began, and would revolutionize warfare as we know it. This is video footage of a British Mark I. Although the tank would change warfare, this did not spare it from problems during its early deployment and battlefront use. In fact, of the 49 tanks brought forward at Fleur-Courcelette, only 25 actually moved forward during the attack. Almost all broke down at least once, and only 9 made it across no man's land to the German side. Eventually, through the course of the war, British made improvements to its original Mark I and eventually introduced the Mark IV in 1917. It benefited from significant developments such as better armor and the redoing of its fuel tank. However, it should be noted that the top speed of most tanks, regardless of the side, was roughly 4 miles per hour. The British were not alone in tank development. This is the French Renault FT light tank. It was the first tank with a fully rotating turret that we know in modern tanks today. However, one country that lagged in tank development was Germany, who often salvaged British and French tanks for research and the use on the battlefield, simply repainting them with German markings. The flamethrower, first used by the Germans, brought terror to French and British soldiers and was quickly adopted by both sides. It came in various forms, typically carried on a single soldier's back, and could shoot a flame roughly 60 feet. However, many soldiers did not like carrying these devices, which made them huge walking targets and could sometimes explode even when not pierced by bullets, turning the wearer into a human torch. Grenades, as with other weapons, significantly improved during the duration of the war. They came in various forms. The German soldiers in this picture are getting ready to throw stick grenades, nicknamed potato masher grenades. There were also grenade launchers from rifles and various other hand grenades, like the French F1 grenade that was preferred by both French and American forces during the war. Airplanes were mainly used for reconnaissance and observing enemy positions, but also used to bomb troops and famously air-to-air combat or aerial dogfights. Both Allied and Central powers deployed these planes. In fact, France produced some 68,000, but lost some 52,000 in battle, a loss rate of 77%. However, the most famous pilot of the war was a German ace, Manfred von Richthofen, or the Red Baron. Although the Zeppelin was embraced by both the Germans and the Allies during the war, Germany made by far the most extensive use of the rigid, hydrogen-filled airships. The concept of strategic bombing and targeted airstrikes on a particular location did not exist before the conflict. Zeppelins were also used for reconnaissance and troop movements like airplanes. The advent of the German Zeppelin changed aerial warfare, robbing the British of the protection afforded to them by the English Channel historically. The Zeppelin allowed Germany to bring the war to the English by night bombing London with airships which flew higher than anti-aircraft guns could fire. However, incendiary ammunition, which could ignite the Zeppelin's hydrogen insides, quickly hindered some of the effectiveness of these airships. Artillery reached new levels of importance on the battlefield with several developments in artillery warfare. It could now be fired with new high explosive shells and throw them further and at higher rates of fire with greater accuracy than ever before. They were also used before and in conjunction with infantry attacks or rolling barrages, a technique that was developed during the war. One example of these new artillery pieces was the German Big Bertha howitzer gun. They were designed to overcome modern Belgian and French fortifications built with reinforced concrete. At the time of their construction, they were the largest, most powerful mobile artillery pieces in the world. The gun could fire shells weighing over 1,700 pounds over 6 miles, an unheard of distance at the time. The chief advantage of a mortar was the fact that it could be fired from the relative safety of the trench, avoiding exposure of the mortar crews to the enemy. Furthermore, it was notably lighter and more mobile than other larger artillery pieces. And of course, the very fact that the mortar bomb fell almost straight down meant that it, with any luck, could land smack into the enemy trench. Poison gas was employed by both Central and Allied powers and ranged from disabling chemicals such as tear gas to lethal agents like phosphagen, chlorine, and mustard gas. It could also be released by giant tanks and hoses or by firing shells filled with the gas. These were some of the most feared weapons of the war for soldiers and would be banned after the war during the Geneva Protocol in 1925 and are still technically illegal in warfare today. Various breathing apparatus and gas masks were used to counteract gas attacks. The British soldiers on the left have smallpox respirators or SBRs, which was a vast improvement on the first breathing devices. On the right are Germans with their GM-15 gummy masks, which were improved in various incarnations throughout the war. What was revolutionary about these masks were the interchangeable canister filters, which the Allies almost immediately began copying. These British soldiers have been blinded by a German gas attack, most likely mustard. The killing capacity of gas was limited. Roughly about 3% of combat deaths were due to gas, or about 91,000 total deaths. However, the proportion of non-fatal casualties was high, and gas remained one of the soldiers' greatest fears. World War I was one of the deadliest conflicts in the history of the human race, in which over 16 million people died. The total number of both civilian and military casualties is estimated around 37 million people. The United States actually got off lightly, with just over 100,000 deaths in the one full year they were involved in the war, with no civilian deaths. The next graphic shows total military deaths by country.